Hey guys, tonight we step way back into a world of sand, sun, and suds. You're not scrolling your phone anymore. You're standing beside the Nile River in ancient Egypt around 2500 BCE, and something thick and sweet-smelling is bubbling in large clay vats. It's not soup, it's beer. And you're here to learn exactly how the ancient Egyptians brewed it, not just for daily life, but for the afterlife itself. The air is warm and damp with the scent of river mud, fermenting grain, and sun-baked reeds. There's a soft rhythm in the distance, the slap of sandals, the splish of water in amphorae, and the occasional donkey braying, like it's had a little too much of the house ale. You're standing outside a brewing compound made of mud brick. The walls are low open to the sky and buzzing with quiet life. Right now, you might be wondering, wait, how do you even brew beer without metal thermometers or a clean kitchen? Short answer, you don't. Not cleanly, anyway, and you probably wouldn't survive drinking it unless your gut had years of training. But that's the beauty of this story. It's messy, it's ancient, and somehow it worked. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you're watching. I love seeing how far this sleepy caravan travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the outer courtyard, careful not to trip over a drying net or a loaf of grain bread cooling on a flat stone. The heat of the day is fading, but the bricks still radiate warmth. There's a woman crouched near one vat, checking the consistency of what looks like porridge. She gestures for you to come closer. This is beer-making ancient Egyptian style. It's not a craft, it's a rhythm, woven into the lives of workers, priests, and royalty alike. You lean over a vat and peer inside. It's a thick, sludgy blend of partially baked bread and water, more stew than beverage at this stage. Historians still debate whether the beer-making process began purely by accident. Perhaps some leftover grain porridge was left too long in the sun and started to bubble. Or maybe, as some believe, it was an early form of food preservation gone deliciously wrong. Either way, Egyptians didn't just tolerate this stuff, they loved it. Beer was so central to Egyptian life that it had its own goddesses. Genenet and Menket were brewing deities, but Hathor, goddess of music, joy, and sometimes chaos, was closely tied to beer's more spirited outcomes. You'll meet her again later, preferably during a festival. Even now, beer is more than just a beverage. It's payment for labor, an offering to the gods, and a daily staple for people of every class. One ancient inscription from the Middle Kingdom boasts about workers getting their rations 10 loaves and 2 jugs of beer. And not fancy beer, just the hearty grain-thick kind that you could probably chew. As you move past the vats, a child runs by with a gourd full of beer clutched in both hands. You sidestep to avoid a splash and realize this isn't a luxury item. It's hydration, sustenance, and maybe a little light buzz for good measure. Even babies got diluted beer, partly because the water wasn't always safe. The sun begins to dip, casting everything in gold. You glance at the surrounding fields, lush with barley, wheat, and flax. These were the lifeblood crops, and barley especially was destined for brewing. But don't expect fine pilsners or crisp lagers here. Egyptian beer was unfiltered, often cloudy, with chunks of grain and traces of bread floating in the mix. You'd sip it through a straw, sometimes made of reeds or decorated ivory, to avoid swallowing too much sludge. Here's a strange little tidbit: some elite households added herbs, dates, or even sycamore figs to their brew for flavor. Whether this made it tastier or just more fermentable is up for debate. One ancient recipe might have even included frankincense, yes, the same stuff from temples. If that doesn't scream beer fit for the gods, nothing does. Of course not, everyone had access to the good stuff. The average worker's beer was hearty filling and probably tasted like wet cereal that had been left out too long. But it did the job. And if you were preparing for death and the great celestial bar crawl in the afterlife, you'd want some packed with you. In tomb paintings, beer is shown being brewed, poured, and offered to the deceased right alongside bread and incense. It wasn't symbolic, it was a practical provision. You couldn't risk going thirsty in the underworld after all. You feel the day slowing. Workers gathered to wash clay pots, stack bread molds, and sweep the grain husks into neat piles. The brewing continues, but more gently now, as the sky turns violet and the Nile glimmers like obsidian under the moonlight. And just as you're starting to feel drowsy, a soft breeze carries the earthy warm scent of fermenting grain past your nose. It's not unpleasant. It's like sourdough and river fog and maybe a hint of goat. Comforting in a weird way. So, you settle onto a woven mat just out of reach of the fire pit and watch as the stars slowly poke through the sky like someone pricked holes in a scroll. The night deepens, and the story keeps flowing. You wake with a little start. Not that you ever really fell asleep, just drifted, lulled by the scent of clay and barley, and the low hum of frogs chirping in the distance. The stars are still out, but the brewery courtyard is stirring again. It's time to get into the actual mechanics of how this ancient magic was made. Let's begin with the essentials: water, barley, and let's be honest, a generous helping of dirt. Egyptians didn't have filtration systems, but they did have the Nile, and it served as both lifeblood and liability. The water they used came straight from the river, or from stored jugs that might have marinated in yesterday's fishy breeze. And yet, this was the water of creation, and they trusted it. Mostly. Your hands dip into a large pottery jar. Inside is a sloshy, semi-murky mixture of crushed sprouted barley and lukewarm Nile water. It feels like lukewarm oatmeal and smells a little like gym socks left in a bakery. This is the wort, the base of the beer. And yes, you're expected to help stir. Grain was a staple crop here, particularly barley, which they processed in ways modern brewers might find both horrifying and ingenious. First, it was soaked and allowed to sprout slightly. Germination activated enzymes in the barley, which helped break down starch into fermentable sugar. Today we call this malting. Back then they just called it "don't toss it," yet it's not rotten enough. Once malted, the barley would be ground roughly between two stones. You kneel beside one such setup now, passing gritty handfuls through your fingers. It's coarse, more cracked than milled. This was not refined flour. It was about as elegant as grinding rocks. Occasionally, you find tiny chips of sandstone in the mix. Consider them added minerals. There's a fun little scholarly tiff about how much grit ancient people accidentally consumed thanks to these stone grinding tools. Some researchers estimate that dental erosion in ancient Egyptians rivaled that of modern people who chew on gravel for a hobby. Others argue it wasn't so bad, just a side effect of rough baking and sandstorms. Still, you make a mental note, maybe sip the beer gently later. Now, back to the blend. The crushed barley is added to the Nile water and left to steep somewhere between just soaking and starting to ferment. It's unclear exactly how long this phase lasted, since records weren't written in hours or Celsius. Instead, brewers relied on feel smell and, frankly, luck. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians used yeast intentionally at this stage or just let nature take the wheel. Wild yeast from the air likely landed in the mixture and started to bubble. No one added yeast from a jar or packet. There were no starter cultures passed down from generation to generation like sourdough heirlooms. And yet, it worked. Some scholars even suggest that brewers might have used bits of fermented dough or leftover beer slurry as a rudimentary starter an intuitive move if you noticed yesterday's bucket fermented better than today's. Whether it was tradition or superstition, you weren't going to toss the bubbly stuff. You're handed a paddle carved from tamarisk wood. Your job is to keep the mash from settling too heavily and to encourage fermentation. You stir gently, feeling the thick mixture resist. A few gnats buzz lazily near your face. You bat them away and someone chuckles. That's the thing about brewing, it's not just chemistry, it's community. Nearby, a brewer squats beside a shallow clay basin filled with warm water and adds crushed dates. These sweet fruits weren't always part of the standard recipe, but they could give the brew a little extra sugar and thus a little extra kick. He grins and says something you don't understand, but the meaning's clear. This one's gonna be strong. You're shown another bowl where emmer wheat has been added to the mix. Emmer was another grain staple often used alongside or instead of barley. It's heavier, nuttier, and can make the beer heartier. And yes, occasionally things went fungal. Not in the pleasant probiotic way, just moldy. But the heat of the day and the lack of sealed containers meant spoilage was part of the process. Egyptians probably drank the stuff before it turned too far south. Or maybe they didn't mind. Let's not forget that while beer was important, it wasn't sterile. There were bits of this and that in every jug. Insects, bits of reed sand, even the odd frog leg. Amphibian protein was probably not advertised on the label, but if it floated in, it floated in. A strange little papyrus scrap once described using Natron Egypt's version of baking soda to clean brewing equipment. Did it work? Maybe. Did it taste like soap? Possibly. But it was likely more about ritual cleanliness than microbial hygiene. The Nile gods were picky about offerings, even if they weren't microbiologists. By now, your hands are sticky with grain residue and the sun is climbing again. A new batch begins and the routine resets. You notice how little measuring actually happens. There are no spoons, no scales. Everything is done by feel, by memory, and by observing the bubbling of the mixture. If it fizzes too fast, maybe add more bread. If it's too quiet, wait, or hum, or bribe the gods. And yet, as you sit back and watch a row of clay jars start to tremble from fermentation, you realize something oddly calming. It's all a living system. The brewers are part of it, the environment is part of it, and even the yeast unseen uninvited is part of it. You take a deep breath. The scent is stronger now, sour, a little nutty, faintly sweet. Your eyes start to droop again. The rhythmic sounds of stirring, pouring, and scraping blend into a kind of lullaby. A brewer pats your shoulder and hands you a small gourd. It's warm and slightly fizzing. You raise it to your lips, give it a sniff, and maybe later. You lean back against a cool mud brick wall, watching the first rays of morning sunlight catch the lip of a ceramic jar. Brewing in ancient Egypt wasn't about perfection. It was about participation. And you're already part of the batch. The sun is high now, casting short, sharp shadows across the courtyard. You hear the soft hiss of clay lids being lifted and the muted thud of baskets being set down because it's time for the next key step, turning all that barley sludge into something drinkable. Welcome to the land of bread beer. You follow two workers, women, both of them, one humming the other, scolding a goose that has absolutely no business near the grain. They beckon you to a wide, low oven set into the ground. It's not your modern pizza oven. This is more like a wide clay dome with a few chips and soot marks. Inside, the heat is already rolling out like an invisible wall. This is where the real foundation of the beer starts with loaves. But not the kind of loaves you slice and serve with butter. These are dense, gritty, partially cooked barley bread lumps. You reach out and lift one, it's warm, soft in the middle, with a tough outer shell. Imagine undercooked banana bread, but with the flavor profile of Hay River silt, and possibly disappointment. These beer loaves, called busa by some modern scholars, weren't baked to be eaten. They were baked to be crumbled. And now it's your job to do just that. You sit cross-legged on a reed mat and start breaking one open. It crumbles with a slightly damp squish like stale cornbread left out in the fog. The inside is still raw enough to encourage fermentation, and the outer crust is just solid enough to hold its shape. The goal here wasn't flavor, it was sugar extraction. You mash the bread into a basin of lukewarm water, forming a slurry that looks, frankly, unappealing. But this was ancient brewing efficiency at its peak, a way to preserve sugars, initiate fermentation, and transport raw materials in portable loaf form. Historians still debate whether these loaves were always made with yeast-rich dough, or if the yeast came later from wild exposure. Some argue the loaves were already fermenting before they hit the vat. Others suggest it all happened during the soaking stage. What they agree on, it worked, and the beer kept flowing. A quirky twist in some cases, these loaves may have included herbs, honey, or date paste. Imagine beer with a little fig jam tang if you were lucky. But for the average household, it was plain barley, maybe emmer, and whatever your kitchen rats hadn't stolen. The two women beside you begin to sing. It's rhythmic and low, almost like a hum. You ask what the song means, and one of them taps her chest, and then the bread mash. You get the feeling it's a brewing chant meant to bring good fermentation, or just to pass the time while your hands go numb in wet barley. It's here that the communal nature of brewing becomes undeniable. Women dominated this phase, mothers, daughters, house servants, all working together, laughing, singing, sometimes cursing. Brewing wasn't just labor, it was a domestic ritual, a social glue. And let's not overlook the divine layer. Remember Hathor. She was also known as Mistress of Drunkenness, and she was honored with festivals that quite literally revolved around drinking to the point of ecstatic transformation. So, this humble loaf, it was part of something cosmic. You press the mushy bread into a clay bowl with holes at the bottom. This makeshift strainer lets the sweet liquid drain through, leaving behind a lumpy mess of fiber and husk. You're handed a small reed straw, no filter, no carbonation, just warm, sweet, lightly alcoholic liquid, straight from the gods, or the floor, depending on how you look at it. There's a quiet debate among archaeologists about whether the bread and beer process evolved from baking, or whether the two existed side by side from the start. Bread was sacred, beer was essential, and the line between them about as thin as your straw. As you take another sip, you notice how filling it is. No wonder this stuff was considered food. In fact, the Egyptian word for beer, henket, shows up in texts alongside bread in contexts of wages, offerings, and even contracts. I will give you 10 loaves and 5 jars of beer is basically the ancient equivalent of 15-hour and a benefits package. But here's something even stranger. In a few burial chambers, archaeologists have found small ceramic models of bakeries and breweries, miniature scenes frozen in time. Little statues of women baking, mashing, and pouring. Why? Because if you were rich, you didn't just want beer in the afterlife, you wanted the staff to keep making it for eternity. The day continues. More loaves are baked, mashed, and stirred. You're sweating, sticky, and slightly tipsy from your third sip. A worker laughs at your expression and hands you a fig. You eat it, unsure if it's a palate cleanser or just a polite distraction. Then someone points to a bundle of reeds near the oven. Wrapped in linen are small lumps of something malted barley drying in the sun. You pick one up. It's warm, sweet-smelling, and strangely comforting. This little bundle is where it all begins and ends. And just as you're about to stand, you spot a fat cat curled in the shade beside a jug of beer, tail, flicking eyes half-lidded in ancient feline judgment. Even the animals here understand the value of a good nap near the brew. You lie back on the mat again, barley-scented air wafting around you, and think if you had to spend eternity somewhere, this wouldn't be the worst place. The air is thick with barley steam now. Your fingers are wrinkled from kneading and mashing, and you've got tiny flecks of grain stuck in your sleeves. But you're not done yet, not even close. Because now comes the part where everything either goes deliciously right or quite literally sour. It's time to ferment. You follow the others into a smaller chamber off the main courtyard. This one is shaded with woven palm mats and smells, well, different, like damp earth overripe fruit, and something a little musky, almost like wet bread left out in the sun. Congratulations. That's the scent of wild fermentation. Here, large clay vessels some half your height are lined up against the walls. Each one has a wide opening and a broad rim, almost like an open-mouthed yawn. Some are already bubbling quietly, while others sit still waiting for their moment. This is where the magic happens. You peer into one vat and see a swirling mess of mash water and foam. A brewer dips in a small cup and lets you sniff. It's sweet, yes, but there's also something sharp beneath it, tangy like apple cider gone rogue. That's the yeast doing its work. And the wild part, nobody added it on purpose, unlike modern brewers who keep yeast strains in laboratories and refrigerate them like royalty. These ancient Egyptians relied entirely on the environment. Yeast from the air, from the grain, from hands, clothes, cats, even from the walls. Everything contributed. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians had any sense of what yeast was. Some say, yes, they noticed that certain batches always fermented better in the same spot. Others say it was just trial error and ritual. Either way, they got results. Consistency, not guaranteed potency, sometimes shocking. You lean back against a pillar and watch as one brewer stirs the vat with a long reed pole. He moves slowly, deliberately, as if not to disturb the invisible guests in the jar. Another woman leans over her vessel and murmurs something quietly. A blessing, a warning. Hard to say. But you get the feeling the yeast likes attention. Interestingly, some archaeological digs have revealed that certain breweries may have reused the same fermentation jars over and over again. Why? Because the porous clay absorbed yeast into its walls, creating a kind of living vessel. Each batch then was a descendant of the last. It's like keeping a sourdough starter alive, except it's the whole jar doing the remembering. Some vats are covered with linen cloths, others left open to the air. You ask why, and an elder brewer shrugs. The gods know. Which is ancient Egyptian for who knows, but we're not messing with it. The temperature here is crucial. Too hot, and the yeast dies. Too cold, and nothing happens. But Egypt's climate, with its warm days and cooler nights, provides the perfect natural incubator. You can almost hear the fermentation working, tiny bubbles rising, soft fizzing like a sleeping cat's breath. You're handed a small amphora to clean. It's dusty and has a few ancient-looking scratches on its neck, but the inside smells faintly sweet. This jar's been part of the process for years, maybe generations. You rinse it with warm water, swirl, and pour, careful not to crack it. These aren't just containers, they're tools and maybe even co-workers. Then comes the taste test. A brewer ladles out a portion of frothy liquid into a small bowl. She sniffs it, sips it, nods, and passes it to you. You brace yourself. It's warm, a little gritty, and not awful. Tangy with a whisper of honey and something nutty underneath. You've had worse IPAs. Here's a fun fringe fact: some researchers believe certain brews may have been mildly hallucinogenic, thanks to natural compounds from herbs or from grain that had started to ergotize. No, the Egyptians weren't tripping through the afterlife, but they may have experienced a little divine inspiration. Of course, not every batch was perfect. Some fermented too long and turned sharply acidic. Others failed entirely. When that happened, the brew was sometimes reused as vinegar or poured into fields as a strange sort of compost offering. Waste, not worship, more. Fermentation lasted 1 or 2 days, maybe 3, depending on the weather and the desired strength. The resulting beer wasn't bottled or stored the way we do now. It was consumed fresh, often within a day or 2. Cold storage wasn't a thing. And honestly, lukewarm barley beer was kind of their brand. The brewers start marking the jars with little clay seals symbols etched in while the clay is still wet. These indicate who made the batch when and sometimes what kind of beer it is. Sweet, strong. For gods only. You see one marked with a tiny eye symbol. That one, they tell you, is for temple use. Historians still argue whether those temple batches were actually different or just given a divine marketing label, maybe both. But in some records we see that certain brews had names. One papyrus even mentions something like the one that makes you forget, which might be the ancient world's first hangover joke. The day starts to slide into late afternoon. The shadows grow longer, the fermenting jars hum a little louder, and the brewers begin the slow task of skimming foam, checking jars, whispering to each other over the bubbling. You sit beside a jar and place your palm gently on its side. It's warm alive, not just a drink, but a creature. Growing, shifting, becoming beer, and you're part of it now. Your breath, your footsteps, your laughter, all swirling in the silent song of fermentation. You close your eyes and imagine what the gods must think, watching their people nurture barley and time into something worth sipping in eternity. Maybe they smile. By now, the beer has done its thing, bubbled, thickened, fizzed softly into life. And yet, in its current form, it's more of a hearty soup than a beverage. It's gritty, lumpy, and contains enough floating debris to qualify as a light meal. You take a closer look at a jug and see what appears to be a piece of straw, or possibly a small leaf, or if you're honest, a mystery object best left unidentified. So what's next? Filtration. Ancient Egyptian style, which means patience, gravity, and baskets woven by someone's very talented grandmother. You're led to another corner of the brewery, where the brewers have laid out a setup so simple it borders on genius. There's a wide, shallow basin lined with tightly packed reeds. Above it, a jug is propped at an angle, its contents slowly glugging through the makeshift strainer. The liquid that comes out below is still cloudy, sure, but it's less chunky. Progress. You're handed a sieve around, flat-woven disc that feels both fragile and eternal. It's been used so many times, the middle has darkened to a permanent malt-colored stain. You hold it over a jar, pour, and wait. The beer trickles through, leaving behind a fibrous sludge of barley bread bits and maybe a guessed gnat or two. Some sieves were made of cloth, some of palm fiber, and the wealthier households might have even had bronze strainers. But out here it's reed baskets, careful hands, and gravity doing most of the work. You can't rush it. Try pouring too quickly and the basket clogs. Try poking it, and you risk breaking the weave. So you sit, legs crossed, chin in hand, watching your beer dribble through like honey in slow motion. A meditative exercise, albeit one with a slightly sour aroma. Historians still argue whether beer was filtered before fermentation or after, or possibly both. There's evidence for multiple approaches depending on the brewer, the purpose, and probably how much time they had before temple inspections. One theory suggests temple beer was filtered more carefully to make it clean for divine consumption. Another theory counters that gods don't mind a little grit. Here's a quirky tidbit. One preserved letter from a scribe mentions straining beer through a woman's linen garment, possibly a repurposed headscarf. Whether this was common practice or a moment of desperation remains unclear. Either way, that's one laundry load you'd want to do separately. As you pour the next jug, you realize something else. Filtration wasn't just about texture. It was about storage. Less sludge meant slower spoilage, fewer bugs, and happier priests. Not to mention easier drinking, especially when you didn't have a straw handy. Speaking of straws, one brewer pulls a bundle of them from a basket. They're made of reeds, some wrapped in colored thread. A few are decorated with small carved charms. You ask why. He just grins and says, "To please the beer." Fair enough. You take a sip through one, it helps. The liquid is still thick, like drinking liquid porridge with a splash of apple cider, but it's smoother now. You nod, and the brewer seems pleased. Now, storage. The filtered beer is poured into amphorae, those tall, slender jars with two handles and a pointed base. You help tip one into another, feeling the warmth of the clay and the slosh of ancient hydration. Some amphoraes are sealed with clay stoppers. Others are covered with palm fiber plugs or linen cloth tied down with string. A few get sealed with wax. You ask what determines which. The brewer shrugs. Depends who's drinking, meaning regular folks get palm plugs. Priests and nobles get waxed luxury. There's a whole unwritten language in how these vessels are treated. One, marked with a lotus symbol, likely means temple batch. Another, with a carved ibis, possibly for a priest. One with no markings at all. House brew, probably best consumed quickly before it turns. You notice another amphora off to the side wrapped in a damp cloth. It's staying cool, clever trick. The evaporation from the cloth draws heat from the jar, keeping the beer inside slightly fresher. No refrigerators here. Just science sand and a little ingenuity. Beer that wasn't meant for immediate drinking might be buried partway in the ground or kept in cool storage rooms. But most of it gone within a few days. It just wasn't built to last, unlike wine, which smugly ages in clay silence elsewhere. Speaking of which, you spot a few workers carrying jugs of wine past the brewery. They're headed to the temple. One of the brewers makes a face. "Too sweet," he mutters. You sense a friendly rivalry, but we'll get to that feud later. For now, you're back to filtering, pouring, sealing, wiping your brow, and laughing with the others as someone tries unsuccessfully to balance a full jug on their head. You take a break and sip again. The taste is still complex, but it's growing on you. As the sun begins to slide downward again, a priest arrives to inspect a few of the sealed amphorae. He murmurs a short prayer, sprinkles a few drops of perfumed water near the jars, and nods. You're not sure if the beer passed the test, or if he's just relieved you didn't serve him frog-flavored ale. You sit on a warm stone, your shadow long on the courtyard wall, and watch as the day winds down. Amphorae are stacked in tidy rows, baskets are washed and set to dry, and someone plays a soft tune on a reed flute nearby. The beer is ready, and you're still not sure whether to call yourself a brewer yet. But you're definitely part of the team. The brewery may be quieting, but the rest of Egypt hums along, fed and fueled by the golden, grainy drink you've spent the day immersed in. Because beer here isn't just a treat or even a profession. It's a necessity. You wander out of the courtyard and onto a well-trodden path that leads toward the workers housing modest mud brick homes scattered along the edge of the fields. You're greeted by the scent of stew bubbling in clay pots and the comforting buzz of conversation carried on the breeze. A few children dart past you barefoot and laughing, one holding a reed straw like a scepter. In the nearest home, a woman crouches beside a low table, ladling warm beer into a small bowl. She sets it in front of a toddler who happily begins sipping. You blink. That's right, children drank beer. Not just teens sneaking a taste behind the temple wall. Little ones. It was the safest drink, around more nutritious than raw Nile water, and diluted enough not to turn them into pint-sized partiers. Egyptian beer wasn't filtered with clinical precision. It still had calories, plenty of them, and sometimes functioned more like liquid bread than buzzworthy booze. A typical laborer might drink several liters a day, especially if they were working in the fields or hauling limestone to the pyramids. Forget energy drinks. This was the original electrolyte solution. You're handed your own bowl by the woman, and she gestures toward a low bench. You sit. The brew is thinner than earlier, lighter, almost refreshing. It's been diluted with extra water and served cool from a buried jug. You nod in thanks, and she smiles, wiping her hands on her tunic. Historians still debate whether beer was always served this way in homes, or if this watering down was a matter of availability. Was it thrifty housekeeping, or was it a deliberate act of moderation? Some scholars argue that lower classes drank more heavily diluted beer, while priests and elites enjoyed the thicker, richer varieties. Others suggest it depended on the household, the season, and how much grain was left in the storeroom. What's clear is that beer was everywhere. In one famous letter from a laborer, he complains bitterly about being shorted on his beer rations, more upset about that than missing pay. And when you're hauling 50-pound stones in 100-degree heat, fair enough. But the beer wasn't just for people. A farmer walks by with a small clay pot balanced on his palm. Inside, a slosh of beer, an offering. He sets it gently near a carved stone at the edge of his field, murmuring thanks to the local spirits. You follow him curiously and realize that this spot decorated with flowers and a few spent bread loaves is a tiny shrine. Beer wasn't just nourishment, it was respect. In temples, priests offered beer to gods daily, just like incense bread and roasted meats. You imagine the gods lined up divine mugs in hand, politely pretending not to notice the occasional batch that had gone a little too funky. Cattle, too, had their turn. Sacred bulls, like the Apis bull in Memphis, were sometimes given beer-soaked feed. Not to get them tipsy, of course, but as a symbol of abundance. The bull represented strength and virility, and beer was considered an extension of that divine nourishment. There's even some evidence to suggest that funerary feasts for the dead involved beer, not just as libation but as communication, a way to toast the spirits to say, "Here's something from our world to yours." You watch as an elderly man pours a thin stream of beer into a tiny cup and carefully places it on the windowsill of his home. He closes his eyes, presses his hands together, and stands silently for a long moment. That cup isn't for him. It's for someone who left long ago. You take another sip, and the simplicity of it strikes you. This drink, coarse, cloudy, and ever-changing, connects gods, laborers, mothers, kings, bulls, and toddlers. It builds pyramids, fuels, rituals, fills stomachs, and accompanies souls on their eternal journeys. Here's a curious side note. Some medical texts from the time mention beer as part of remedies. Beer mixed with herbs, beer with ground dates, beer infused with garlic. Everything from indigestion to childbirth cramps had a brew-based cure. Whether it worked is another matter, but at least the patient was relaxed. You pass by a modest shrine at the edge of the village. Carved into the wall is a faint relief of a woman holding 2 jugs. It's hard to make out, but someone nearby tells you it's a depiction of Chenenet, a goddess of beer. You trace the outline with your fingers worn smooth by wind and time. A goddess of fermentation, a patron of patient bubbling. As the sun sets again, the village dims, fires flicker, children are called in, and jugs are sealed. You hear a flute in the distance again, and maybe, just maybe, a song about beer. You walk slowly back toward the brewery, where the night shift is just beginning. Yes, beer was brewed in temples. Yes, it was packed into tombs. But it lived here in courtyards and kitchens and straw baskets and shared bowls. It lived in the hands of people who stirred, poured, filtered, and sipped. And you're beginning to feel it now, that sense of soft connection of history, flowing through your fingertips like foam over clay. One last sip, and you rise. The stars above are thick and unblinking. The earth is warm under your feet. And the beer is everywhere. You rise early the next day, or maybe it's still the same day. Time in ancient Egypt seems to melt like wax under the sun. Slow, deliberate, cyclical. The brewery is already alive again, but this time you're not headed to the village. You're going deeper. Into the temples. The path leads you past lotus ponds and limestone columns, each one carved with symbols you don't fully understand, but somehow feel familiar. There's a hush here, not just silence, but reverence. You step through the threshold of a temple complex and are immediately struck by the coolness of the air. The scent changes too. Incense crushed flowers, perhaps the faintest whiff of something sweet and malty. Yes, even here amid gods and granite there is beer. This is not your humble backyard brew. This is beer made for gods. You're led through a side chamber where a priest, head-shaved linen tunic spotless, guides you to a dim room filled with large, carefully arranged vats. The setup is familiar, but neater, more precise. There's a strict order to everything. You get the sense that even the yeast behaves more politely here. Temple breweries were often part of large complexes. Archaeologists have uncovered them connected to temples at Karnak Abydos and Tel El Amarna. These weren't casual operations. They had specialized staff designated brewers, scribes to record quantities, and a schedule that ran like clockwork, because the gods didn't appreciate late deliveries. One priest shows you a scroll covered in neat hieroglyphs. You can't read it, but he explains that it's the brewing calendar. Offerings of beer had to be prepared on specific days in specific amounts depending on the festival or deity. Hathor might get a stronger batch during her feast, Osiris. Perhaps something earthier, more subdued. Historians still debate whether these temple beers were truly different in recipe or simply offered with more ceremony. One camp insists the gods demanded richer, thicker beer made with dates or honey. Another suggests the process was identical. It was the setting and symbolism that elevated it. And speaking of symbolism, one temple record describes a beer offering that included 14 different jugs, each with its own name, its own purpose. One was for purity, one for joy, one for rebirth. Another was labeled to soothe the wrath of the gods. You take a wild guess that one had the highest ABV. You move to the next chamber and see a row of small amphorae sealed, labeled, and placed beside statuettes of deities. One of them is tipped forward as if mid-pour. A priest touches it reverently and begins a soft chant. You realize he's offering a drink to the god right there and then. Not metaphorically, literally. The gods in Egyptian belief were sustained by offerings. If you didn't feed them bread, beer, incense, they grew distant, irritated, maybe even dangerous. Beer wasn't optional. It was spiritual maintenance. Here's a quirky tidbit in some ritual texts. Beer is described not just as a drink, but as a bringer of voices. It was thought to help open the mouth of a statue so it could speak, accept offerings, even bless the people. You look at one of the statues now, eyes lined and coal mouth, frozen in serene judgment, and wonder what stories it's tasted. The atmosphere shifts again. The priest now leads you to a sacred brewing room, cleaner, quieter, more like a laboratory than a kitchen. The brewing vessels here are smaller, the ingredients finer. You recognize barley, but there's also what looks like pomegranate rind, perhaps a jar of date paste, and even an exotic spice or two. This is specialty brewing, divine microbrewing. One brewer explains half in gesture, half in words, that these ingredients were reserved for festival beer made in small batches. During the annual Feast of Hathor, the temple would distribute hundreds, sometimes thousands of jars of strong beer to attendees. It wasn't just for drinking, it was for transformation. Ah, yes, transformation. You've heard whispers of what happens during these festivals. Dancing, music, frenzied celebration. A chance to let go, to release tension, to become a little more godlike. You picture it a courtyard packed with people all swaying, clapping, drinking from clay mugs painted with flowers. The air thick with incense and the metallic pulse of sistra rattles. And at the center, Hathor's priests pouring the sacred beer. Historians still argue whether the intoxication at these festivals was seen as literal connection to the divine or simply as a fun excuse. Likely both. In one surviving hymn to Hathor, worshippers beg her to flood them with joy, to let the beer rise in their hearts. Back in the temple, you're handed a small cup, delicate, fired to a smooth finish. Inside is a sample of the ritual brew. You taste it. It's richer, sweeter, somehow heavier. Like regular beer went to finishing school. The priest nods solemnly, then points to a painted scene on the wall, a procession of servants carrying amphorae, followed by musicians, dancers, and finally a scribe recording it all. You smile. The beer gets its own parade. Outside, the sun has risen fully now, casting warm gold light through the columns. You hear the chanting begin in the main sanctuary, and the smell of incense floats down the hall. The gods are awake. The offerings are ready. And as the first hymn rises through the stone halls, you realize that brewing this messy, sticky, fragrant labor isn't just for the living. It's for the eternal. The beer in your hand may be warm, slightly fuzzy, but it's sacred. You take another sip and close your eyes. You find yourself walking along the outer walls of the temple, your footsteps muted by the dust of centuries. Your head is still pleasantly fuzzy from the sacred sip, your thoughts slow and round, like the amphorae you helped seal just days, or was it hours ago? But now, your guide waves you toward a different kind of place. It's quiet, cooler. A breeze whispers through papyrus reeds nearby. You're entering the necropolis. But don't worry, this isn't the creepy kind of graveyard. It's beautifully planned, full of sun and silence, and carved deeply with promises. You're surrounded by tombstone chambers and deep shafts sealed with symbols, and you quickly realize that beer didn't just live with the people of Egypt. It died with them too, or, more accurately, went with them. You pause before one open tomb, its entrance framed with painted bricks and a faint trace of old incense smoke. Inside, it's dim, but you can make out rows of painted scenes on the wall. Farmers in fields, bakers shaping loaves, brewers pouring jugs, and in the center a deceased man seated calmly receiving a cup of beer from a younger servant. This wasn't decoration. This was documentation. In ancient Egyptian belief, you brought the necessities of life with you into the afterlife. If you liked beer in life, and most people did, you were going to need it on the other side. After all, eternity is a long time to go without a drink. You walk further into the chamber, the air smelling faintly of dust, myrrh, and something sweet. On a low stone shelf sit two small amphorae still sealed. One is labeled with a faded hieroglyph that your guide traces gently. "Henket," he murmurs. "Beer?" Historians have found similar jars in tombs across Egypt, from small burials to royal tombs. Some were filled with real beer, others with substitutes, malted grain, dried mash, or symbolic ingredients meant to activate in the afterlife. Just add spiritual water, apparently. One fringe theory even suggests that certain tomb brews were fortified with special herbs or perfumes to elevate their status, to appeal to gods, or maybe just to help the soul settle in. It's as if the afterlife had its own elite craft beer scene. You duck into another chamber and see something stranger still, a carved model of a brewery. Tiny figures barely the length of your hand are immortalized mid-task. One stirs a pot. Another strains beer through a woven basket. A third offers a cup to a miniature nobleman with a ghost of a smile. These models weren't toys. They were insurance. If your soul got to the field of reeds and the beer supply was lacking, these little helpers would pick up where your earthly brewers left off. You touch the cool stone of the wall and stare at the scene so familiar, so quiet. Brewing wasn't just life, it was legacy. Your job, your home, your favorite drink. They followed you. And in grander tombs, beer got even more reverent. Pharaohs were entombed with massive supplies, sometimes hundreds of amphorae stacked in sealed chambers, carefully labeled by origin and type. Imagine King Tut's tomb gold jewels, and a healthy dose of barley booze. You stopped beside a low basin carved into the tomb floor. Your guide explains that this was sometimes used to pour libations, liquid offerings to the gods or to the deceased. Beer, wine, water, milk, anything the soul might need. You imagine someone standing here thousands of years ago, gently tipping an amphora forward, letting beer spill into the basin as they whispered a name, a prayer. Maybe they cried, maybe they laughed. Maybe they poured one out for a friend, just like we do now. Historians still debate whether these funerary beers were actually consumed in ritual or just symbolic placeholders. Some records suggest mourners did drink at the gravesite sharing cups with the dead. Others claim the beer was meant only for the soul essence of the deceased. In truth, maybe it was both. Outside the necropolis stretches in every direction rows of tombs carved steely half-buried amphora shards. A cat darts between stones. You hear a woman softly singing as she sweeps dust from a grave marker. Life hums here too. And then something truly curious. Your guide gestures to a buried storage room recently excavated. Inside, archaeologists found a jar, intact, sealed, still full. Chemical analysis showed it once held beer. Real beer, over 3,000 years old. It had lost its fizz, of course, but the ingredients were unmistakable barley emmer dates. You imagine opening that jar. Would it smell familiar? Would the gods recognize it? Would it taste like history or like disappointment? Probably both. You sit quietly at the edge of a low wall gazing across the tombs as the sky warms to soft amber. It's peaceful, not solemn, not sad, just slow, eternal, and full of barley. The afterlife in this culture wasn't a cloud-filled abstraction, it was a continuation. And you needed your comforts, bread music, loved ones, and beer, especially beer. You take a breath. The air is heavy with centuries and sunshine. You close your eyes and think about that tiny brewery model, the one in the tomb with the smiling noble. He's probably sipping a cup right now. In the field of reeds, watching the sunset. Smiling. Waiting for you to bring the next round. You leave the necropolis behind, stepping carefully over dry earth and ancient roots, amphora fragments crunching softly beneath your feet. The mood lifts as you make your way back to the riverbank where the Nile glistens under the soft orange glow of the late afternoon sun. You're about to witness the logistics of ancient booze, because even in a world without trucks, spreadsheets, or next-day delivery beer had to move. A lot of beer. You arrive at a busy port, if you can call it that. More like a stretch of river lined with tethered reed boats and men shouting about cargo. Amphorae, dozens of them, are being loaded with care onto barges, some cushioned with straw, others sealed tight with clay or wax. You're not here to brew today. You're here to ship. It turns out beer didn't just slosh around within a village. It traveled. By donkey cart shoulder and especially by boat. The Nile, Egypt's eternal highway, wasn't just a river. It was the bloodstream of the kingdom. Everything flowed with it: grain taxes, temple offerings, gossip, and of course, jars and jars of freshly brewed beer. You step onto a flat-bottomed cargo boat, the deck lined with woven mats to keep the amphory from cracking. A few clay seals still glisten from recent stamping names of priests, brewery workers, overseers, maybe even the gods. The boat rocks gently, tugging at its mooring. Historians still argue how far beer was transported. Some say it was strictly local, too perishable for long journeys. Others point to temple records showing shipments sent from royal breweries to far-flung work crews, even to garrisons near the borders. A fragile commodity, maybe, but they moved it anyway. Here's a fun fringe tidbit. Some inscriptions describe beer being delivered to construction sites with exact rations: 40 jars to the North workers, 12 to the Western group, 3 to the man who overslept. Okay, that last part might not be documented, but you get the picture. The wind picks up as the barge pulls away from the shore. The Nile is broad here, slow but powerful. Papyrus reeds bend lazily, and the water smells like sun-warmed clay and old stories. You crouch beside a pile of beer jugs and help secure them with ropes. They're surprisingly heavy, filled not just with liquid, but with value. This is currency. This is morale. This is what keeps workers building temples, scribes copying scrolls, and priests nodding approvingly in candlelit chambers. As you float downstream, you pass another boat heading the opposite direction, smaller, sleeker, likely carrying luxury wine for the elite. The helmsman waves and your captain scoffs good-naturedly. You're reminded again of the quiet tension between beer and wine, one rustic, one refined. We'll get into that later. For now, you're watching riverbanks drift by, palm trees, small fishing huts, sun-baked cattle, and children splashing near the edge. Every now and then, you see a worker wave as the beer boat glides past. Word travels quickly. Beer is on the move. You stop at a way station, a mud brick platform shaded with woven reeds. A man greets the boat and begins counting amphorae, tapping each one, inspecting seals, scribbling notes on a wooden writing board coated with wax. Ancient inventory management alive and well. There's a sense of rhythm to it. This isn't a wild party delivery, it's serious business. The temple expects its offerings. The overseer wants his payroll beer. The gods want their froth. Sometimes beer was delivered as part of ritual processions. Imagine rows of white-robed attendants carrying beer jugs to temples during festivals, walking slowly accompanied by music, each step a prayer. The act of transporting beer was sacred, logistical, and deeply human all at once. You're handed a mug by one of the deckhands, a reward for your help. This batch is lighter, thinner, but slightly fizzy. River beer, made for the journey. You sip it slowly, watching hippos bob just a little too close to the boat for comfort. Here's a strange little side note. Some brewing records mention beer as part of military rations. Imagine marching through the desert sun with a jar of barley beer strapped to your pack. Hydrating. Yes. Heavy. Absolutely. Worth it, you bet. As the boat continues, the river curves gently, and the sun slips lower, casting copper reflections across the water. It's quiet now. Just the rhythmic slap of the current against the hull, the creak of ropes, and the faint buzz of distant insects. Your thoughts drift. Beer traveled, and in doing so, it connected the kingdom. It made it possible for builders to raise obelisks, for traders to barter far from home, for priests to conduct rituals in the heat of noon. It was more than a drink. It was infrastructure. You rest your head against a coil of rope and look up at the sky turning purple. The boat glides on steady and calm like a memory made of grain and water. You smile and think of all the things you've carried today. This one, this humble, sloshy, slightly warm jar of beer, might be the most human. The barge nudges gently against the shore, and you step back onto solid ground with your feet squishing into the soft riverbank. this landing spot feels quieter, more personal. Not a temple, not a brewery, just a courtyard surrounded by the easy, comforting clutter of everyday life. You're in a family home now, low mud brick walls, open-air kitchen, chickens clucking beneath woven baskets, and the lingering scent of coriander and toasted grain. This is where brewing started long before temples claimed it. Before pharaohs, before pyramids, there was the home brewer. And more often than not, she was a woman. You're welcomed by a matriarch with the kind of posture that comes from decades of work and not a single moment of doubt. Her name is lost to time, but today you'll call her the Brew Mother. She gestures for you to sit beside her clay hearth, where a small fire smolders and pots simmer with thick aromatic mash. Here, brewing is less ceremony and more intuition. A handful of emmer wheat here. A splash of sweet date paste there. A gentle stir with a polished stick darkened by use. Everything is done by feel, by taste, by the mood of the day. Historians believe most brewing in ancient Egypt began in the home, with women like this crafting small batches for daily use nourishment for the family payment for laborers' offerings for household gods. While temple records are etched in stone, domestic brewing lived through memory repetition and maybe a few whispered tips passed from mother to daughter. You crouch beside the brew mother as she crumbles dried bread into a bubbling pot. The bread is dense, packed with malted grain and the faint perfume of honey. She stirs slowly, letting steam rise, then dips a finger in and tastes eyes closed, brow furrowed. She nods. It's ready. The pot is set aside to cool. A clay jug already fermenting from yesterday's batch is uncovered nearby. You peer inside and see the telltale foam small bubbles huddling along the surface. No measuring tools, no thermometers, just trust. Historians still debate whether these home brewers truly understood fermentation or simply observed its patterns. Did they know the word yeast? No, but they knew what worked. And sometimes knowing the result is more important than knowing the reason. You're handed a bowl, unfiltered, warm, faintly sweet. This is the house blend. You sip and discover that it's smoother than the temple batch, maybe a little thinner, and definitely seasoned with smoke and sunshine. It tastes like home. There's a curious practice the brew mother shows you. She wraps a bundle of herbs, something like coriander, and maybe fenugreek, and lowers it into the beer like a tea bag. She hums softly as it steeps. She says the herbs are for cooling the blood. Maybe it's medicinal, maybe it's flavor, or maybe it's just tradition. You help her skim foam from the top and gather spent grain to dry for tomorrow's batch. Nothing goes to waste here. Leftover mash might go to feed the goats or be shaped into small cakes and dried for storage. One of the children nearby calls them beer cookies. You make a note not to eat too many. Another woman arrives with a basket of reeds. Together they weave a new strainer, tight, circular, elegant in its simplicity. You offer to help and they chuckle at your clumsy fingers. Still, they let you try. And by the end, your fingers are scratched, but you've helped create a filter that will serve this family for weeks. Here's a charming tidbit: some houses had brewing songs. Not hymns like the temple, but lullabies for the beer. Little rhymes to stir by, to strain by. Songs passed down as part of the recipe. A few lines survive in scattered texts, nothing complete. But today the brew mother hums a tune that might have been sung centuries ago. As the sun dips low, the whole family gathers. Bowls of beer are poured, bread is shared, lentils passed around. One child blows into a reed straw and pretends it's a flute. The brew mother laughs and hands him a smaller mug with the foamy dregs. This isn't just a meal. It's a celebration of routine, of warmth, of knowing your hands made something that feeds, comforts, and connects. You look around and realize that these women working without scrolls, without temples, have kept the essence of brewing alive longer than any monument. Their beer doesn't end up in history books, but it ends up in bellies. And that, they'd probably argue, is what counts. As the sky darkens, the courtyard fills with firefly glow. A jug is passed your way again, cooler, now smoother. You drink and feel the day slip further into memory. If the temple was a cathedral of brewing, this home is its beating heart. And as you lean back surrounded by laughter, steam, and flickering flame, you realize that maybe the gods didn't invent beer after all. Maybe they just borrowed it from a mother with a good recipe. You wake to the sound of distant flute music and soft conversation, the kind of gentle clamor that hints at something more organized than a family dinner. Something ceremonial. You sit up, stretch your legs, and catch the scent on the wind beer, yes, but something richer, heavier, a little fancier. It's festival day, and you're about to step into the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a cultural turf war, beer versus wine. The walk toward the temple district takes you past a bustling marketplace, where vendors offer grapes, honey garlic, and yes, more beer, though this time in smaller lacquered jars tied with palm rope. Nearby, you notice wine amphorae being unloaded from carts. Long, elegant jars with pointed ends and stamped labels. The wine crowd is here. They've arrived with swagger. You've tasted both by now, of course, but what you didn't realize is that in ancient Egypt, beer and wine weren't just drinks. They were identities. Beer, earthy, local, practical. The drink of farmers, builders, servants, soldiers. Wine, imported, refined, expensive. The drink of scribes, nobles, and anyone who could drop a few extra deben of silver on fermented grapes. And yet both were deeply embedded in ritual. Both were offerings. Both were believed to carry spiritual power. You duck under a sun canopy and find yourself in a courtyard where priests are preparing for a Hathor festival. There's incense-burning musicians tuning long-necked lutes, and a massive clay vat of beer at the center frothing gently in the sun. You're handed a cup almost immediately. It's strong, darker than usual, and perfumed with what might be tamarind. You sip. It's better than usual. Someone added honey. You approve. Nearby, another group huddles around a tray of wine bowls, whispering in reverent tones about vintage and region. One man claims the grapes came from the Delta. Another insists they were pressed in Siene. You quietly note that the beer people are laughing more. Historians still debate the role of wine in Egypt's early periods. Some believe it was reserved almost exclusively for the elite pharaohs, priests, and high-ranking scribes until the New Kingdom, when it became more widespread. Others argue it was always present, just overshadowed by beer's sheer volume and practicality. A quirky tidbit: while beer was used in childbirth rituals and daily prayers, wine shows up in love poetry. One famous line reads, "I will drink the wine from your lips." Not exactly something you say about cloudy barley mash. But beer had its own romance. It was the drink of the people. It filled stomachs, warmed hands, and softened hard days. And when the festivals began, it made everyone a little more divine. Back in the courtyard, the festival is ramping up. Musicians play a rhythm that seems to make the air dance. Dancers in linen robes spin arms, lifted fingers flicking like candle flames. You're invited to join the procession and honor your told. The first group carries beer amphorae. The second wine, jugs painted with symbols of Isis and Osiris. You choose beer, of course. You're among barley people now. As the parade winds through the streets, people cheer. Bread is handed out, flowers tossed, and somewhere nearby, someone is definitely already tipsy. Not drunk, just divinely relaxed. At the front of the procession stands a towering statue of Hathor carried on a wooden platform. She's adorned with gold cow horns and a sun disk. Offerings are placed at her feet: jewelry, bread, fruit, and a massive amphora of sweet beer. Here's where it gets fascinating. During some Hathor festivals, participants drank themselves into altered states, believing it brought them closer to the goddess. This wasn't seen as indulgence. It was ecstatic communion. And it wasn't always peaceful. Historical records mention beer-fueled brawls, broken amphorae, and festival hangovers that lasted for days. But the joy that was part of the ritual. One priest steps forward now and pours a stream of beer onto the ground, an offering. The smell rises with the heat, yeasty, sweet, vaguely spicy. A reminder of the earth, the grain, the work. You stand still watching the foam soak into the dust. The wine group does the same, though their pour is thinner, less frothy, more elegant. You suspect they judge your bubbles. You don't care. Here's something unexpected. Even in royal tombs, beer and wine appear side by side. In Tutankhamun's tomb, amphorae of both were found, some labeled with brewers' names, others with vintage dates. The pharaohs played both sides. The festival winds down with food, laughter, and a few naps in shady corners. A priest catches your eye and raises his cup. The gods drink both, he says with a grin, but they wake up with beer. You laugh. Maybe that's the answer. Wine may have the poetry, but beer has the punchline. You lie back on a reed mat, the music fading into the distance. Someone nearby hums a brewing song. The last rays of sun shimmer on the rim of your empty cup, and in that quiet moment it doesn't matter which drink wins. You've already chosen your side. The next day begins not with drums or flutes, but with a strange, sticky silence, the kind that follows a festival. You wander through the now quiet courtyards past a few sunburnt revelers, still sleeping it off beside half-spilled amphorae. Someone snores gently into a linen sash. Beer-soaked sandals hang from a tree branch, and you choose not to ask. Today, the story shifts again. Not to temples nor to house courtyards, but to the realm of myth where gods and beer blur together in ways that are both oddly poetic and, well, a little terrifying. Because today you're going to learn about red beer and the time it saved humanity by putting a goddess to sleep. The tale begins with Hathor. You know her by now, goddess of joy, music, beauty, and merriment. But she had another side, Sekhmet. The lioness, the destroyer. The one with a thirst not for beer, but for blood. According to myth, when humans turned against the gods, Ra, the sun god, sent Sekhmet to punish them. She descended upon the earth in a frenzy, fierce and unstoppable, tearing through cities and fields. Blood flowed like rivers. Humanity was on the edge of annihilation. You imagine the scene, burning fields, terrified prayers, the roar of a goddess with eyes like fire. Not exactly bedtime material, but stay with me. The solution. Beer. Ra, horrified by the destruction, devised a plan to save what was left of his creation. He ordered the brewing of thousands of jars of beer tinted red with pomegranate juice or ochre, depending on which version of the story you hear. The brewers worked day and night. Amphorae were filled. The beer was poured across the fields where Sekhmet was expected to strike next. From a distance, it looked like blood. Sekhmet arrived. She saw the red liquid. She drank and drank and drank. Historians still debate whether this myth originated as a symbolic representation of harvest cycles or as a way to explain the dual nature of Hathor, both joyous and wild. But one thing is clear in this story: beer doesn't just calm people, it calms gods. Eventually, the goddess passed out drunk, soothed, transformed. When she awoke, she was no longer Sekhmet the destroyer, but Hathor the joy-bringer once more. You're standing now beside a small shrine dedicated to this very story. Painted on the walls is a vibrant scene, a lion-headed goddess mouth open in a roar, and beneath her rows of jars spilling red foam. A priest nearby pours a thin stream of colored beer onto the earth and whispers a quiet prayer of peace. It's ceremonial, yes, but also deeply practical. The story served as a warning, a lesson, and a recipe. If rage is the fire, then beer is the water. You ask how often the ritual of red beer was repeated, and a temple worker tells you it still occurs once a year, even now. A symbolic act. Red beer is brewed, poured, and offered to Sekhmet to keep her sleeping peacefully, just in case. You try a small cup of the modern version beer laced with crushed dates and a touch of red pigment. It's sweet, heavier than usual, and oddly calming. You can see why it might put even a goddess to bed. Here's a charming tidbit. Some versions of the myth claim that after the beer nap, Sekhmet woke up with a hangover. And so began the tradition of appeasing the lioness with offerings music and continued beer distribution. In other words, breakfast, soft singing, and gentle apologies. You walk through the shrine gardens and reflect on what you've seen. The ancient Egyptians didn't separate myth from life. They didn't just believe in gods. They brewed for them, fed them, sang to them. And when things got dangerous, they reached for what they knew best: beer. Even now, you can imagine a child hearing the story for the first time, eyes wide, imagining Sekhmet staggering through a beer-drenched field and collapsing into a snoring puddle. The lesson: be kind, be joyful, and never underestimate a cleverly brewed batch. As the afternoon sun warms the red-stained walls of the shrine, you sit beneath a fig tree and sip again. The breeze smells like ripening grain and river wind. The goddess sleeps, the people celebrate. And the beer. It tells the story better than any scroll. The evening air is cool again, but tonight it carries a different scent. Wood smoke, strange herbs, and something fermented that doesn't smell like beer. You've wandered beyond the familiar Nile banks and into a trade encampment where tents flutter in the wind and languages overlap like woven mats. You're here to discover what happens when Egyptian brewing meets foreign flavors, because while the Egyptians cherished their beer traditions, they weren't exactly brewing in a vacuum. Trade brought not only goods, but also new techniques, ingredients, and sometimes surprises. Your first stop is a Nubian merchant's tent. The man grins wide and gestures for you to sit. He offers a bowl of beer, thicker than usual with a dark, reddish tint. You sip and blink. It's tangy, sharp, and smoky. Not bad, just unexpected. This is Nubian-style beer, possibly using millet or sorghum instead of barley. The texture is different, the flavor more earthy, and it finishes with a slightly numbing spice. You ask what's in it, and the brewer shrugs, saying, "What the land gives." Historians have long debated the cross-pollination of brewing techniques between Egypt and its neighbors. While Egypt had its own established methods, contact with Nubia, the Levant, and even Mesopotamia likely influenced everything from ingredients to vessel design. One curious artifact found near the southern border was a brewing vat, with a style more consistent with Central African techniques, suggesting a richer brewing history than previously assumed. Whether the Egyptians adopted these styles or simply appreciated them from afar remains up for discussion. You're ushered to another campfire where a Canaanite trader is soaking figs in a wide bowl of cloudy beer. It smells sweet and sour at once, almost like cider. She says it's fermented with fruit skins and herbs, and calls it a sleeping drink. You try it. It's gentler, more aromatic beer's daydreaming cousin. Here's a charming tidbit. Some Egyptian records describe foreign beers as curious or strong of mouth, but there's evidence that temple brewers experimented with imported ingredients, especially during festivals. Date wine, fig beer, honey brews, all inspired by contact with other cultures. You imagine a temple brewer sneaking in a pinch of Assyrian spice into a sacred batch just to see how the gods might react. Bold move, possibly delicious, possibly smiting-worthy. Even more fascinating, beer was sometimes used as a diplomatic gift. One letter from a pharaoh to a Hittite king includes a mention of jars of the golden brew, a peace offering, literally. You watch as a woman from Punt pours a glowing amber-colored beer into a shell cup. It smells of tamarind and sandalwood. You ask her what it's called. She replies with a word that translates roughly to quiet fire. It lives up to the name. As the night deepens, the trading camp glows with firelight and laughter. No one here cares about the beer versus wine debate. They drink whatever is good, interesting, or simply nearby. A young boy offers you a tiny ceramic cup filled with a brew that fizzes slightly. You ask what's in it, and he beams. Bee beer, turns out it's a mead hybrid, fermented with honey and wildflowers. Sweet light and just enough alcohol to make your nose tingle. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians made mead regularly or only encountered it through trade. Some tomb paintings suggest honey was added to beer for flavor or preservation. Others think it was a rare delicacy. Either way, it makes for a beautiful finish. The traders pass around cups, and someone starts to sing a soft, low melody in a language you don't recognize. You sip and listen. The song isn't about gods or rituals or myths, it's about barley. Just barley, growing, swaying in the wind, being gathered, soaked, and shared. You lie back on a reed mat and gaze up at the stars, thousands of them, sharp and steady. Somewhere, beer is still bubbling in a jar. Somewhere, a brewer is humming a song they don't remember learning. And here, under foreign tents and unfamiliar songs, you feel something universal. Beer isn't just Egyptian, it's human. You awaken to the beat of distant drums and the low rolling hum of a crowd gathering. Another celebration. Apparently so, but this time you're not in a temple courtyard or a family home. You've stumbled into something much more chaotic, much more alive. Welcome to a beer festival. Ancient Egyptian style. You step through a wooden gate woven with palm fronds and suddenly find yourself in the middle of a sprawling gathering. Think fewer tickets and food trucks, more baskets of bread goats milling underfoot, and at least one man trying to balance an amphora on his head while dancing. This is a celebration of Hathor, and unlike yesterday's quieter rites, today's festivities are loud, raucous, and gloriously messy. Beer sloshes from bowls. Musicians clack wooden clappers and rattle sistras, filling the air with a bright, metallic rhythm. Women dance barefoot in the dust, hair braided with flowers, voices rising in laughter and chant. You're handed a jug before you've even had time to blink. You sip it stronger than usual, spiced, thick, and deeply malty. Festival beer without a doubt. Historians describe these festivals with equal parts awe and caution. Called feasts of drunkenness, they were not metaphorical. During certain celebrations, participants were encouraged to drink until they entered an altered state believed to bring them closer to the divine. One famous festival in honor of Hathor reenacted the myth of Sekhmet and the red beer. Participants would drink themselves into ecstatic states believed to be both protective and cleansing. You sit near a group of older women playing a drinking game involving painted stones and improvised poems. One recites a verse about a beer jug with hips like a dancer. The group roars with laughter. You're invited to try. You pass. Nearby, a man plays a double flute, his eyes half closed, swaying with the rhythm. A few younger festival goers start to chant nonsense words, or sacred syllables you can't quite tell. Either way, the sound is hypnotic. Here's a strange but delightful tidbit. Some ancient texts describe beer festivals that included flute girls, women hired to play dance, and sometimes serve drinks. Their performances were part of the celebration's allure, music and intoxication interwoven in a divine blur. You catch sight of a group painting clay mugs with lotus flowers and tiny birds. Souvenirs, perhaps. Or maybe ritual items. One man dips his thumb into beer and presses it onto a jar's surface, leaving a round print. He grins. You copy him. Historians still debate whether these festivals were controlled affairs led by priests or more grassroots gatherings where joy just spilled over. Either way, they happened, and they happened often. There's evidence that workers on state projects were given time off for beer festivals. Even prisoners were sometimes released temporarily during major celebrations. Imagine that a brief reprieve, a bowl of barley brew, and a night under the stars before going back to your duties, whatever they may be. The sun dips lower, and the energy of the festival shifts. It becomes warmer, softer, less chaotic, more collective. Fires are lit. Bread is shared. A child falls asleep in their mother's lap, while a circle of elders sings an old song about the goddess who drank the blood of the world, then danced until the moon forgave her. You realize something important. This isn't just a party. It's a release valve, a social mechanism, a spiritual exhale. The people of Egypt worked hard, sacrificed much, and lived by cycles of flood and famine. But every so often they were allowed to forget, to drink, to dance, to feel something other. You lie back on a straw mat near the edge of the festival, eyes half closed, body loose with barley warmth. Someone nearby is still singing. You catch the words, grain of the sun and cup of stars. You smile. The metaphors are as loose as your limbs. A breeze lifts the edge of your robe. Ash floats gently from a cooking fire. A woman refills your cup without a word. And as the stars return steadier than any festival, older than any brew, you understand the true gift of beer in this world. It's not just about rituals or wages or even nutrition. It's about joy. The kind that bubbles up unplanned. The kind that doesn't need to last forever to matter. The kind that knows exactly when to arrive. The fire has burned low, and the last of the music has drifted off into silence. You sit quietly now on the banks of the Nile just beyond the flickering torchlight of the festival. The river laps gently at the reeds. Somewhere behind you, someone snores. Tonight is different. There's a hush to it, like the air itself is catching its breath. Because tonight you're not brewing beer. You're not drinking it or pouring it for gods or dancing with strangers. Tonight you're preparing for the end, but not the kind of end you might think. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't final, it was a transition. And beer was part of that journey too. You've seen it already in tombs, in tiny clay models, in red offerings to sleeping goddesses. But tonight you're helping prepare the real thing. Before you lies a linen-wrapped body someone once called neighbor or uncle, or maybe the man who made the good lentil stew. He's quiet now, but his journey is only just beginning. You help a small group of mourners place items beside the body, bread amulets, a worn reed mat. And of course, beer. A single jar still warm from the last batch, sealed carefully with clay, and marked with the deceased's name. It will go with him, through the underworld, across the fields of judgment, into the arms of Osiris. Here's something comforting. Ancient Egyptians believed the afterlife was a continuation of earthly pleasures. There would be fields to plow, music to hear, food to taste, and beer, always beer, to soothe the soul and keep the dead from feeling forgotten. Historians still debate whether these afterlife provisions were symbolic or literal in belief. But the careful way the jars were sealed, labeled, and placed, every action, said the same thing: you'll need this where you're going. A priest arrives now, murmuring a prayer, placing his hand over the jar. It's not ornate, not jeweled, just clay. But you've seen what's inside, and you know it's enough. The body is carried toward the tomb, quietly, respectfully. The mourners follow some holding small cups. They pour a little beer on the ground, then take a sip themselves, a gesture of parting, a bridge across the veil, and then they return home, to life, to work, to grain and ire and song. You sit a little longer at the river holding your own cup. Not drinking, just holding, watching, thinking. Beer was born here from dirt and water and sunlight. It fed the living, pleased the gods, and honored the dead. It was simple yet sacred. It is simple and still sacred. You look up at the stars, one last time now familiar. The Big Dipper, Orion's belt, the silent ships of the night sky. Somewhere among them, a soul is waking, standing, stepping into a new land with a jar of barley beer in their hand and a smile on their lips. They won't go thirsty. They're home. And now, your eyes are heavy. Your breath has slowed. The noise of the festival has faded, and the last embers of the fire glow low behind your eyelids. Let your body soften like warm clay drying in the sun. Let your thoughts settle like the grain husks sinking to the bottom of a brewing pot. You've walked the dusty paths of ancient Egypt. You've brewed with your hands. You've tasted the slow, earthy joy of something made from nothing. You've felt the laughter in the village courtyards and the reverence in temple halls. You've floated down the Nile cradling the weight of a humble amphora. And you've seen quietly and deeply how one drink, cloudy, warm, imperfect, could carry not just sustenance but story. Beer wasn't about intoxication. It was about connection. To the land, to each other, to something beyond. As you drift now, imagine the soft bubbling of a fermenting pot nearby, the gentle scrape of a reed basket, the distant song of a brewer humming in the half-light. You're safe, you're full, you've done your part. Let your thoughts dissolve like foam. Let your breath rise and fall like the Nile. And if your dreams should take you to a sunlit courtyard with bread in your hand and beer in your bowl, know that you're welcome there. Always. Sleep well. Sleep deeply.